Hello and welcome back to another art lesson here with me, Phelim Dunfield from Brushstrokes Art School. I hope you have been all minding yourselves and staying safe and well. For today's lesson, I thought I would do a little bit of drawing with you. But before we do any drawing, I'd like to talk to you about the importance of drawing, because I feel this is something that is often overlooked. And it's overlooked in my experience oftentimes because a lot of people feel that they cannot draw or that they're not good at drawing. And this is something I would hear on a regular basis from people where they say, I'm not good at drawing. In my experience, it's less about being good and more about giving yourself more time to develop it. I find that oftentimes people are inclined more towards painting than drawing. And that, I think, is because there's obviously the excitement of colour and the drama and the playfulness of that, but also colour hides an awful lot. Colour is very strongly associative to the object that you're painting. So for example, if I were to give you an orange to draw, unless you're quite good at drawing, you may well find it difficult to represent that in a realistic fashion, and it could well turn out to look like a potato or something else. And if I brought that outside and I showed it to 5 people, they might well tell me that it's anything but an orange. Whereas if you've never painted before and I give you some basic rudimentary reds and yellows and I say make a painting of an orange, even in the most basic and rudimentary fashion, if I bring that outside and show it to 5 people, the same 5 people, chances are they're going to tell me it's an orange, because the colour of the orange is so strongly associated that even if it's a weak painting, they'll guess that it's an orange. So in order to describe that sense of clarity with pencil or pen or brush requires a greater sense of discipline and detail. So realistically, in order to learn to draw, one has to spend more time practicing. And there's a sense that is quite chorish or quite difficult or quite laboured or quite boring in the early stages. And I suppose learning to draw at the beginning does take a fair amount of discipline. It does take time. But what I've also discovered is that when you give yourself the opportunity to draw, when you give yourself over to the drawing process, and when you've given yourself the time to practice it and give yourself a certain level of skill, your confidence grows, and through that growing and through that practice, your drawing grows. And your drawing can get to a level where it's equally as enjoyable as your painting. But you do have to put yourself through a certain amount of time and perseverance in the beginning to get to that level. But when you get there, what you'll discover is that drawing is as equally rewarding as painting is to you. There's a wonderful sense of therapy. There's a wonderful simplicity in being able just to pick up a pencil and to use that to sketch and to draw. And not even just realistic things, but just to doodle and just to meander and just to wander. And I was showing you how in one of the lessons last week, I was showing you how even just practicing basic shapes and just random shapes can really improve your ability and confidence with holding a pencil, or a pen for that matter, and just improving your general sense of drawing. But moreover, drawing is important because drawing essentially teaches us to understand the difference between what we think we see and what we actually see. And I've mentioned this before, the idea that we go through life and make an enormous amount of assumptions. Whereas if we're going to learn to draw and paint, we have to learn to see the difference between what we think we see and what we actually see. We need to understand the reality. Because if you don't understand that reality, then you're working on the basis of hope over reality, which is not a good place to be. Whereas if you understand how to draw, you understand the reality of what it is you're looking at. If you can see the shapes, if you can see the forms, if you can see the details, you have a choice to draw those as they are, or to deconstruct them and reconstruct them in a different format to suit your own sense of style. So being able to draw is one way of being able to allow yourself to personalize your art and to express yourself in a much more individualistic fashion. And for that reason alone, it's worth trying to develop your drawing. So in terms of just giving yourself greater pleasure, greater understanding, greater mobility, greater variation, learning to draw has massive implications, and positive implications at that, for your painting. Because if you improve your drawing skills, you automatically improve your painting, because that observation that's required to see the shapes and the forms and the details follows through into your colouring. So in terms of your ability to look at not just the separation of colour, but also the breakdown of colour in terms of the lights and the mediums and the darks, and moreover the idea of how colours influence one another. So when you have several objects together, grouped together, they will reflect, depending on whether they're smooth and shiny surfaces or whether they're dull surfaces, whether they're rough surfaces. All of these things have influences, and then depending on the strength of light that you apply to that, that also has further implications. But when you can recognize those things, it gives you, as I said, far more choice, which will enrich your drawing and painting experience far more than ever. Now, the challenge I'm going to set for us today is one that it will seem quite tricky to begin with, and that is, there's lots of things you can draw, and I've often advocated drawing anything. If you're sitting at your kitchen table, just take a coffee cup, take a tea cup, take a piece of fruit, take a piece of bread, anything. It's not about what you draw oftentimes, it's more about how you draw. But one of the best exercises that I can impart to you in terms of learning how to draw is your hands. Now, hands are extraordinarily tricky to draw. They really are. But it's not about being perfect. It's about giving yourself an opportunity just to learn how to see the shapes and see the forms. And especially if you're intending to work in figurative work with as the human body, or especially portraiture, your ability to be specific and accurate and really understand what you're looking at is massively important. And learning to draw your hands is wonderful. And the beauty about drawing your hands is that you're always available. When you decide to sit down to draw, you're available, your hands are there. And you know, even when it comes to working with figures or working with portraiture, you are the best model you have, because when you decide to do it, you're available. All you need is a mirror, and you can use the mirror to look into either for full-length drawings of yourself or just for portraiture and things of that nature. Anyhow, for today's drawing, I'm going to just look at a couple of different shapings of the hand and how you can practice those very easily, just to give yourself a greater sense of understanding of your observational skills and developing those, and of your drawing skills themselves. So let's go and I'll just show you what I'm talking about. Depending on which shape of the hand you choose to draw, there are obviously areas and portions of the hand that are easier to draw than others. So for example, when you look at this particular shape I've chosen here, where I'm seeing soft fist of the hand, it's much more simplistic, let's say, than other views. So for example, if I go to draw this, all I have is the back of the hand here and the thumb. Whereas if I turn my hand around, I can see more of the fingers. That's somewhat more challenging, because now I've got all of this and a little bit of perspective. If I want to make that a more complex drawing, I open up my hand, and as I do that, you can see that I start to see the interior portions of the fingers and the hand. And apart from that, these fingers are starting to come towards me, so there's a great deal of perspective coming into play here as well. So this sort of drawing will be much more challenging, let's say, than that. So let's start off with something like this, which is a wee bit more straightforward. Now, as I draw mine, you may see it slightly differently to the hand, because my camera is sitting above, so it's coming directly down, whereas as I look, I'm looking across at a diagonal, so I'm getting a slightly different perspective to your vision of what I'm seeing, but that's okay. Just be aware of that as you look at it, it appears slightly different. So if I look at this, as before, I will always start with my shape. So I'm not interested in the detail of the fingers. I'm only interested in the shapes that the hand makes. And as I look at this, I'll do it this way. I can see, for example, a somewhat triangular shaping here at the top of the hand, a soft sort of triangular shaping here at the bottom, albeit a bigger one, and then leading into the rectangle on the wrist, and then another rectangular shape here for the thumb. So we'll start with that. So I'm going to start with the idea of the rectangle at the top, or the triangle rather, I should say, there. And I note that this line is coming back here and also there. So I'm conscious of that diagonal that I see in both of those spaces. So I see that there. Then it's coming back in, back towards another diagonal before it hits the wrist, and then the line of the wrist coming down into that space. For the thumb, I can see it's very much over on the right hand side. It's not in the middle, it's over on the right hand side. So I'm going to put in a rectangular shaping for the thumb, just sitting in here. And from my perspective, my angle, my thumb sits somewhat higher than the top of the finger there, so I need to allow for that into that space there, have that just sitting in there in that way. That would be the first port of call that I will do with this. So I have a triangle at the top, a soft sort of triangular shaping here, and then the idea of the rectangle for the wrist and another rectangle for the thumb. That'll be the first thing. If that looks generally correct proportionately, I'll start at a little bit of detail. So I'm going to start just rounding out. I can see the rounding on the knuckle here and on the knuckle there. I'm going to round in a little bit of that, and you can see it dips and comes back out a little bit more rounded into the top of the knuckle on my forefinger here. See that space? Bring this back into the softness of the hand. Now these lines are not straight, and again, it's important to remember when you're drawing hands, as with any flesh, it's not hard like this. It's pliable. There's a little bit of pliability. Obviously here we're closer to the bone, so there's not as much there, but here there's a little bit more fleshiness, and you can feel that. So depending on what you're drawing, you can see that where it's more fleshy, there's a little bit more softness and a little bit more roundness, and these little subtleties help us to distinguish the reality of what it is we're looking at. Now we bring this down and let it, you can see it softly curves back into the wrist, into that space. Bring this down here. For the idea of the thumb, instead I'm just going to round the top section here into that, and I can see it comes out, then it dips in and out again. So I need this to come around, dip in, and then out into the softness at the base of the hand there, like so. And that then drifts on into one or two little soft shapings here into the wrist. And then on the opposite side, I can see it sort of drifts out, not quite as a single line, but it doesn't have the same dips as we have on this side. It comes back in and rounds up into that area there. From there, I can see the spacing between my forefinger and my thumb is more of a semicircle. So I'm just going to put that in to create that negative space to begin with. From there, I can see that there is a crease because the finger's closed over. So going from the top here is a crease that comes down, just leading into that space right there. Then a very small line and another crease coming back in and folding back down into this area, and then another crease coming up into this area, and then a couple of smaller ones there and there. Now I'm not taking out my guidelines just yet. I'm going to continue to leave those there, and I'll rub those out later on. I'm leaning a wee bit heavier than I would normally on my drawing here, just to make sure you can see the lines of my drawing. Normally I would start off with a little bit more softness than this. From there I can indicate where I see the nail at the top of the thumb here. Just put that in there, going up towards the top into that space. Now, as you do this, as I've said with so many of the other demonstrations, you don't have to be perfect. Get used to the idea of the drawing style, get used to the pencil, get used to holding the pencil, get used to the feel of it. Don't worry too much about the detail as yet, the exactitudes of it. You can build up those as you build more confidence. I can see a small sliver of my other knuckle just coming in from here, and that helps to add a little bit more three-dimensionality into the feeling of what I'm doing into this space. Then as I move down, I can see a tiny sliver of the fingers here, one, and another one just coming out from there, two. And then lower down I see the heel of the hand, just part of my heel here, which comes out into this section there, just leads in, and the wrist then starts to widen out from there. Now that would be the second stage where I have a little bit more clarity and a little bit more balance. Now from there I start to go back in and add just a little bit more softness and detail into what I'm looking at. So as I go down rather, put in the creases here along the thumb, make sure that the feeling of width in this space works and balances. Then there's a couple of creases just coming along into this section here, and maintaining a sense of softness, as I said, is important so that we don't overemphasize, letting these curve a little. And I can, if it's easier, put in a little bit of indication of shadow in and around here to give a greater sense of the feeling of depth into that space, into those areas there. Now, if I wanted to, I could take the rubber and I can take out some of those guidelines if I want to give myself just a little bit more cleanliness and space, and just to see the width of the various different areas that I'm looking at. And I can also use that as a sort of blending format just to give a little bit more softness. And that would be the very first little exercise that I would try to do in just drawing my fingers or drawing my hand to get used to the idea. You can see it's not perfect, but it doesn't have to be. It's more about just getting a little bit of practice and becoming familiar with the shaping of the hands. So for my next drawing, I'm going to make it a little bit more complex, and I'm just going to open up my hand a little bit more. So I've now just simply expanded. So I've gone from there and I've opened out a little. So it's just adding a little bit more challenge. It's the same idea. I look again to the shapes that I have. So I'm looking at the middle shape to begin with here, coming down towards the wrist, this area. I can see the triangular shaping here, so I'm going to go to that next. Then I have another shaping of the fingers coming out, and I can see how the fingers, there's the heel, or the soft fleshy part of the hand, and as I take the line up, I can see that my fingers sit out beyond that line. So I've got to make sure that the fingers are kind of coming out and coming back into this sort of spacing loosely. So I'm looking at those shapes and then back into the wrist. From there, as before, putting in some sort of rectangular shaping for the thumb. Now, this thumb sort of sits in and around, just slightly higher than that, just about there. Now, if again, as before, I'm happy with this, I'll add a little bit more detail. So now I'll start to draw in again the large knuckle area first. So I'll take that, and you can see there's quite a significant dip back into the top of my forefinger there. Round that in here, it softens. I've got another knuckle, just part of the second knuckle showing through, and then it comes round into that space. So there's a couple of shapes, and again I may be seeing things on this that you're not, because my angle is slightly different, but you'll get the point of what I'm talking about. Then from there the thumb rises slightly above that, comes back in, and I can see it rounding in, so it's a soft curve into that space. And on the outside it does curve again, because I slightly turn, so I'm seeing the shapes slightly exaggerated into this space. Back in onto there, and then once more the soft fleshy part of the hand leading down into that area there. Now from there I need to make sure that there's a feeling that it's wider here, so I'm going to just come back in a little into that and just soften that line there. Now from there I'm going to take the idea of the tip of my forefinger sitting in here, and I can see the extension of that coming through, so I'm going to crowd that there, put in the soft crease, bring it back. So the inner parts you can see are very padded, so everything is rounded because of that fleshiness. And then here from there is a large crease comes down, and then another one into that space. You kind of just take one, two, and this rounds out a little like so. I can see a part of the inner finger just in here, and again some of the creasing there, and that again comes right down, and that is one of the longer ones coming out, slightly turning, and I can see that coming into about there. Then the one below it, which I don't see any of the interior from my perspective, but I see it sitting out on the outside, and it's coming in line with just down about here, and then a small portion of my little finger, and I can see it coming right about that way and around. Now I think I've allowed the thumb to sit too high at the top, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to narrow that down a little. I'm going to bring it back in a little here, and I'm going to bring that back there, and let it come out this way. And as part of that, I'm going to widen this section out a little. And I've discovered that I've allowed the angle of this to be too straight, so I'm going to just give it a little bit more depth. And because it's too straight, I've allowed this space here to be too narrow. So I've recognized the mistake, now I need to correct it. One of the tips I would always give is don't rub out until you've corrected the mistake, because 9 times out of 10 we go back and we do the same thing. So I'm going to just widen this out a little, making the base of the thumb and the base of the hand significantly wider here than I had allowed for it, to give more depth into this space. And when I've done that, then I can take out the lines I no longer need. So use your mistakes as guidelines to correct them. I find that a very easy and more successful technique. Now from there, I'm just going to tidy up some of the spaces that I have there. Just fill in some of these little areas here. I don't see the nails in those, but you can see again, there's tiny little dips here and there. Now, one of the mistakes I find people often make when they're drawing and painting hands is they tend to make them too static, too straight. When we look at our hands, they're much more uneven and much more gnarly than we might like to think that they are. And it's important to capture that because that's much more realistic. Whereas oftentimes if they're made to look too straight, they look too static, too flat, almost claw-like. It's often been said that the sign of a good painter is his or her ability to paint hands or to draw hands. And trust me, while this exercise might feel a bit convoluted and confusing to you, if you manage to learn how to draw hands, your ability in terms of your drawing and painting otherwise will be improved significantly, and you'll find it less challenging to draw figures, people, faces, things of that nature. And you can see just a little bit more definition. I will take out some of those guidelines. Once again, we're not trying to do finished drawings. These are more intended just as sort of little quick sketches that you can do just to practice and improve your skills as you're sitting there, either at home or wherever it happens to be that you are in terms of doing that. Okay, and that's number 2. Now let's take a third and final one where we'll make that a little bit more complex. And I'm going to come in and I'm going to open up my hands and we're going to use Okay, for our third drawing, I'm now going to make it a little bit more complex and I'm going to just open up my hand this way and we're going to have this so that you can see the idea of the inner part of the hand. We can see the fingers stretching out and then coming back. So we've added in a much more dramatic feeling of perspective coming towards us. So as before, we look for the shapes. Let me see, make sure you can see that. Okay, so what I want to look at is the idea of the shape that sits in the middle here. So I'm going to go with a more triangular shaping for this section of the hand 1. I can see this is quite triangular, so the hand is rising up and it's coming back in this direction for the fingers as they move in this direction. The wrist then it narrows in significantly for the wrist, so this will be coming back in at a later stage. I'm going to put the rust about there, and then my thumb is sitting out in approximately there. I'm looking to the negative space here to get some indication as to where my thumb is going to sit. So I'm looking at a rectangular shaping, a triangular shaping, another rectangle and another rectangle to get that. Once more, if that looks correct, then I start to add in a little bit more. So from here I'm going to just start to round in the shape of this forefinger as it sits up. Now it's not fully extended, so it looks a tad shorter than it might normally be. Now before I put any detail, I've got to make sure I get the impression of the 4 fingers sitting into the space that I've allowed. So I'm not going to overly detail, I'm just going to put in 1 or 2 very simple shapes just to make sure I get some sense of that. Always looking to the negative space if possible between the fingers to see, and I can see there's a small gap here. Now this one is much shorter and it widens, so it becomes triangular in its shaping here. This is coming back out. This one, there's no real space between them, and again it's shorter to there, and the small finger takes up a little bit more space than you might expect it to, because I'm seeing more of it insofar as I'm seeing part of the side and part of it coming back towards me, so I'm going to allow that to sit into the rest of that space there. Now my hand sits in and starts to round out, so it comes in, then out, then back in towards my wrist there. Similarly, when I look at my thumb, I'm looking at the negative space. I can see if I took a line up, there's the angle I'm looking at between my thumb and my forefinger, so I will replicate that line somewhere about there. So I start to draw in the shaping of the thumb, and I'm bringing in a little because I think that space might be just a bit too wide, so I'm going to bring this in and let it just create that soft lovely little round, and I'm cognizant of the shape and the depth of shape that I'm looking at here into that space before I go into that round. That comes back right this way. Now you can see, as I said before, the hands are not straight, and this is where oftentimes we fall down, we make the fingers too straight. Look at the way it twists in and then comes out at the nail. So it comes back in, then it comes back out, then a little bony portion here, and then it rounds back in towards the wrist from there, and back into the wrist, into that. And that would be kind of step number 2. Quite simple, but just getting a little bit of basic shaping onto it. As before, if this looks correct, I move on. If it doesn't, I try and improve upon that. So once more, I'm coming back into the idea of my forefinger, and just that soft wrinkly portion there, just shape up. So I'm looking at this line, if you can see it there, you can see it's quite soft and curvy, and that helps me to understand the puffiness of the flesh into that space, and then back down into the lower part of the hand here. I can see that there are 1, 2 spaces here in terms of the division of the finger, and it's quite fleshy and round, so I'll start to give a little bit of rounding into that there. This comes back a little bit more angularly and back into this area. Again, a little bit more fleshiness there, a little bit more fleshiness there. Now I'm not going to overly detail that. I'll wait till I make sure everything fits together before I go back in and add any more detail. Then for the second finger, it's a little bit concave here, back out a little bit more, the angle, turn it. Now I see that I can still see the 1 and 2 divisions on the finger, but they're not as clear because it's starting to bend down a little bit more, and I'm going to have to squeeze that space out a little to fit everything in there. So I've got to be careful to make sure I can still fit everything in into these spaces. Then the next one coming in very close to that, back up, turning, there's a few little twists and turns, and then it's almost touching, the fingers touch off almost here into the tip of the finger, and I'm seeing the tip of the finger at this point, back into the little crease there, other knuckle crease there from the inside, and then a small little gap for the small finger, and I see it rounding off here to that space. Now I can see the nail here, and I'll indicate that just to give me some understanding of the fact that it's coming back towards me, and that's very useful. Back out, back in to that space. Then from there, the line that comes back down across here and rounds in, the other one that comes back there. Now back into my thumb, keep that roundness there. Turning in, and I can see a part of the nail, and again I'm going to indicate that just to give me some understanding of what it is I'm looking at into that space. A couple of little turns there for the fleshiness, back in, back around. Now I look at this roundness and this fullness, and I want to make sure that coordinates with what I see here. So when I see the fleshiness coming back in, a couple of little crease lines there, then line of the wrist, and I feel I'm going to make the heel of the hand a little bit wider down here to create a little bit more depth. And the fact that it's sitting down, it's being pushed out, you can see that fleshiness there. I want to really understand and see that. I've let this line come down a little bit too much, so I'm going to just come back here with that, and that should be coming back more like so there. This comes back in here to that space, and that gives me a little bit more clarity. Now from there, I'll indicate just a little bit more tightness onto the drawing itself. Now I'll just rub out what I no longer need, just to give it a little bit more cleanliness. And if you wanted to, you can also just start to put in a few little hatching strokes just to give a little bit of feeling of three-dimensionality to it. So just some soft, simple cross hatching can help to give both a sense of shadow, but also some of the feeling of soft texture to the skin, and that sense of tactility and pliability that we try and capture when we capture and when we draw out the idea of the shaping of the hands. And so that brings me to the end of today's art lesson on drawing. Remember that learning to draw your hands is a very challenging and difficult exercise at the best of times, but that is what makes it such a worthwhile exercise to do. It has really positive implications for both your drawing and painting going forward. So it's worth persevering with, even if you find it tricky at different times. And remember, I always feel that if you're feeling challenged by what you're doing, then you're very much out of your comfort zone. And when you're out of your comfort zone, for me, you're very much in what I like to call the learning zone, which is a really good place to be, because it means you're trying something you haven't done before, and that can only but improve what you're doing. I hope you gained some insights from what I was doing here with the little drawing of my hands. Give it a go yourselves, practice it. Remember, the most important thing is to have fun. Don't worry whether or not your drawings are perfect. Don't worry about trying to have lovely, neat lines and things of that nature. Remember the three things that are important here: developing your observation, developing your hand-to-eye coordination, and making sure that this implement becomes something that feels comfortable in your hands as you draw. That sense of subtlety and fluidity is there. I'll be back again in another couple of days with another drawing theme. In the meantime, enjoy your practice, mind yourselves, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Bye for now. Bye.